When Clovis dies, he ends up dividing his kingdom among his sons. This is actually a trait pretty common of Frankish rulers, which means that instead of having one kingdom, it gets subdivided into three different ones. You don't really need to know what they are. In the grand scheme of things, it isn't all that important. But one of the things that is the hallmark of maybe the next 100 years or so is that these Frankish leaders end up intermarrying with the people who had been part of the Roman Empire living there before. Folks who would have been senators back in the day, and folks who had huge landed estates. And they kind of, through that fusion, create a new hybrid upper class or nobility. One of the things we see happening is that as kingdoms get passed on father to son, the person in charge isn't necessarily always the best ruler just because they've inherited it. And in reality, instead of the king really running the show, a new position, a title known as Major Domus, or Mayor of the Palace, think kind of like a prime minister, comes to exert a lot more power than the king does. It's kind of like the prime minister compared to the queen in England. Who has more power? The prime minister, certainly. One of these guys, one of these mayors of the palace, Major Domi, is a dude by the name of Pepin, and I've got his title up there. He becomes the mayor of the palace in one of the successor kingdoms and ends up, through a lot of warfare and fighting with his neighbors, creating central authority back in a larger Frankish realm. And he expands through lots of wars, unites all those Frankish realms, and actually conquers a lot of areas that hadn't even been part of Clovis's. So Pepin takes the rulers who had been in power, takes the fragmentation of the empire after Clovis had died, and kind of brings it back together. Pepin ends up naming his grandson as his heir, the person who's going to take power after him. And that really POs somebody by the name of Charles Martel, who is Pepin's son, but Pepin's son out of wedlock. In other words, he was a bastard. And what Charles, he eventually comes to be known as Charles Martel, does is he uses lots of military alliances that he had forged fighting under his father to secure and take over his father's throne after his father dies. So he ends up subjugating people in Bavaria, in Frisia. He kicks Saxons out of Francia and becomes known as a really awesome soldier. He creates a full-time cavalry because he recognizes that not only does he have all these other Germanic tribes to fight, by this point, we're kind of looking ahead here a little bit, he's also going to come in contact with Arab forces who have entered the Spanish peninsula. In 732, he's going to defeat them and actually halt the spread of Islam into Europe. We're, again, going to look at that a little bit next week. He recognizes that if he's going to have a full-time army, he needs to pay them. So one of the things he does is he confiscates land that belongs to the church, says, hey, this is my kingdom, and uses that to pay for soldiers and all the things that they need. And when he dies, he is solidly in control. And his one son, another Pepin, this guy, not very tall, so he's given the nickname Pepin the Short, ends up assuming control of the crown. So let's take a little bit of a look at Pepin on the next slide. A lot of the sources for this week connect to these folks, right? So as you think about what is being said about these people, think about who their biographers are. Think about why they write about them the way that they do.